If you're someone like me, history wasn't exactly your favorite subject because the things you had to remember would simply be forgotten by the time you left the classroom. Matter of fact, I may forget everything I'm about to talk about in this video once it's uploaded. It's just that this time it may stick around since I find this stuff to be more interesting. Today I'm going to be talking about some strange wars that you may or may not know about. This isn't exactly educational, but much more of like, yeah, that happened, by the way. I got most of these wars from an iceberg that I would link below for anyone interested in looking at some more strange wars. The first one we're going to be looking at is Mexico's emo versus punk war of 2008. Some background info to know before going into this one is that Mexico seems to have subcultures, especially Mexico City, where the whole story takes place. It was the early 2000s and emo culture seemed to have popped up and quickly gained traction with the youth, with the majority of them being teenagers. But just because their numbers were large doesn't mean that they were respected. Matter of fact, people didn't like the emos, and if it wasn't already obvious, there was one group in particular. Before we get into them, it's important to know that anti-emo behavior was something that occurred normally, so it was literally emos versus Mexico. People would actually team up to beat and humiliate a single emo person. This will include things such as cutting their hair, robbing them for everything they had on them, jumping them, and yelling anti-emo chants. On a serious note, people would actually associate emo culture with homosexuals and bisexuals, and since Mexico was extremely homophobic at the time, this would mean that the general person would target emos as well. This would make it seem that this was just an extreme form of homophobia in disguise. So where did the punks come into all of this? Well, the punks were another subculture in Mexico that had been around for quite a while at this point. They saw the emos were the new kids on the block, and they believed that the emos were stealing their style and identity. They thought of the emos as unoriginal and that they should do their own thing. The punks didn't like how the emos were emotional. They felt that the emos simply didn't want to do anything, and since they were sad all the time, they should simply unalive themselves. Emos and punks would argue over the internet on forums and such, but it seemed that the punks started to take things a little too far. They were making claims that they would lynch emos and started making, quote, terrorist style messages where they made threats that emo should stop being emo or else. Of course, this will all lead towards the war occurring, but what was believed to have been the tipping point was when MTV's Mexico's show Tele Hit aired an episode in which one of its hosts, Christoph Presenta, covered the topic What's an Emo? He made fun of emo culture, stating how it's for people going through puberty and for those who only care about a singer's attractiveness and not their music. At this point, the emos had enough and decided that they were going to do a peaceful protest to demand for their protection. It was organized online, which led to it getting the attention of many people, and it was decided that they were going to meet at Glorieta de Insurgentes in Mexico City, a wide circular concrete plaza where protests were common, on March 16, 2008. Organizing the event online was one of its greatest strengths and weaknesses, since dozens, if not nearly 200 people, the majority of them being teens, showed up for the protest, but it seemed that the event got the punks' attention as well. Not long after, punks also started to show up at the plaza and things started to go down. It first started off as verbal abuse towards one another with slurs being thrown and threats were made towards each other's lives. But things started to get more physical. They started to hit each other with their bolt belts and threw rocks and bottles towards their opponents. Insanity started to rise, which seemed to have gotten the attention of the authorities, since nearly 100 riot police officers showed up at the scene to try to separate the two sides. This ended up being difficult for the police since they were outnumbered by the teens. This went on for a couple of hours and will ultimately stop the war arrived. It was a group of Hare Krishna followers that came in playing music and dancing, and they invited both sides to join in. Of course, neither side did, but it did get everybody's attention and calm both sides down. This eventually led to both sides leaving and putting an end to this war. The aftermath of this was that the hatred between the emos and punks died down, but anti-emo behavior seemed to continue for a bit after that. This next war is something I'm pretty sure everybody knows about at this point, which is the Great Emu War. After World War I, the Australian government gave land to ex-soldiers with the expectation that they would use the land for farming. This wasn't the greatest plan, since most of the now farmers were inexperienced and would struggle to grow crops, and Australia had some pretty bad soil, so farming was already quite difficult. And then the Great Depression started, so the majority of the farmers would have to live off what they were able to grow. So this was a pretty bad scenario for these people. The main ingredient to mess things up would arrive in 1932. An estimated 20,000 emus would roll up from Central Australia to Western Australia, specifically the Campion district, and end up eating the farmers' crops. It wasn't just eating, since they basically trampled everything in their path, including some of the crops that they're trying to get to, and messing up the area allowed small rodents to get into the farm as well, so now there was another pest to deal with. For those of you who are curious on why the emus came over, the simple answer is that emus migrate based on where the better food resources are. Something I found interesting was that the Western Australian emus migrate based on the seasons as well, so they should have been going north, but I guess they said fuck that and started going south. At first, the farmers seem to have wanted to take matters into their own hands and fight the emus themselves, but their lack of resources prevented them from doing so. It seems that it was actually okay for adult farmers to hunt down these emus, since not only were they allowed to, but 10 years before the war, emu status was changed from protected native to vermin, which means, quote, small animals and insects that can be harmful and difficult to control when they appear in large numbers, end quote. These guys aren't small, they're as tall as the average dude. But due to the lack of resources, the farmers requested support from the government, specifically for machine guns to be used against the emus. The farmers originally wanted to use the machine guns since, as I stated, most of them were ex-soldiers and would probably know how to use them, but the government said no. Instead, the government wanted it to look as if they took veterans' concerns seriously, so Minister of Defense George Pierce fulfilled the farmers' request. He had Major G.P.W. Meredith and his two men Sergeant S. McMurray and Gunner J. O'Halloran fight to 20,000 emus. So of course they didn't go in unarmed. Two of them were equipped with Lewis auto machine guns and they had 10,000 bullets to spare. If you do the math, it was expected that a single bullet would kill 2 emus, and if you know about this story, that was obviously not the case. Their first attempt was on November 2nd, which would mark the beginning of the war. They approached a group of 50 emus, but once they started a fire, they realized that they were too far away and the emus were able to escape. The next time they approached a flock of about 1,000 emus, they made sure that they were close enough to actually hit them. Once they opened fire and killed about 12 of them, their guns jammed, so the rest of the emus were able to get away. There was an attempt to mount the gun on the back of the truck, but the rough terrain made it difficult to aim, and the emus were able to outrun the truck, so they won another battle. The emus seem to have been developing strategies themselves, since when the main flock was being attacked, they would separate into smaller flocks so they couldn't exactly be sprayed down. They even got to the point when ravaging the crops, one of the emus would be on lookout and warn the others when it seemed that they were about to get attacked. By a week into the whole thing, they had already used up 1/4 of their total ammo and had killed about 200 to 300 emus. The soldiers actually withdrew and didn't want to deal with the issue anymore. The farmers demanded that they return to battle. They didn't return until 4 days later when the number of emus that they actually killed was revealed to them. They must have been so embarrassed that they returned or something. So over the course of a month, they ended up killing about 100 emus a week. By December 10th, they had already basically used up all their bullets and only had 986 confirmed kills and expected 2,500 more from injury. So if we do the math, it's calculated that it took 10 bullets to take down a single emu. A farmer actually found a dead emu that died from injuries and it had 5 whole bullets in it. Due to running out of bullets and the men being forced to retreat, the emus won the war, as most people know, but there is still a bunch of emus to deal with. So once 1934 started, the government had given the responsibility to the farmers by supplying the ammunition and putting bounties on the emus' heads. It was actually quite successful, since 57,000 bounties were claimed in the next 6 months, and it seems even more were collected by the end of that year and the following ones. For this next war, I'm going to be talking much more about the events leading up to the war rather than the actual war itself, since that seems to be more interesting. This war was China's Opium War. So in 1757, Imperial China established that the Canton port, now Guangzhou, would be its only trading port for foreign trade. Britain obviously wanted to trade and would eventually be butthurt about how there was only one port, but at first they were actually cool with it, since they would trade their silver and India's cotton for tea, silk, and porcelain. Right, so like I said, Britain would be butthurt since they didn't have any resources China would want, so they were forced to use silver. This will cause an outflow of silver and raise its price in Britain. So obviously, in order to combat this, Britain did the obvious, and instead of trading Indian cotton, they traded Indian opium, which ended up being a success since China was now the one paying with silver, and Britain was making a profit. Now Chinese citizens were smoking opium, originally for the pleasure, but they would quickly gain an addiction and would experience withdrawals if they went too long without the drug, and this led to some of them even passing away. The Chinese government realized how terrible the problem at hand was, so they would ban the creation and importation of opium in 1800. 13 years later, they would even ban smoking it and would beat those who did 100 times. Britain didn't want to get rid of this monopoly they had on their hands, so they had private traders transport the drug to the Canton coast and they handed it off to some Chinese middlemen who would take care of the rest. Basically, they were smuggling drugs. This ended up getting quite large, since by 1830 there would be 100 Chinese smuggler ships. This was actually more bad than good, since more people would be selling the drug, and in order to compete with other dealers, prices ended up being lowered. This did end up attracting more people, since it made getting their hands on opium a lot easier, which got even more people addicted. To put into perspective how big the selling of opium got, at first in 1800 to 1801, about 4,570 chests of opium were sold. The amount a chest could carry would vary, but most of the time it was about 100 pounds. From 1820 to 1821, it was about the same amount sold, 4,244 chests, but a decade later, from 1830 to 1831, the amount of chests sold was almost 19,000. And from 1838 to 1839, the amount of chest sales reached 40,000. Something else important to mention is that at the time, Chinese citizens would bury and hide their valuables such as silver and normally wouldn't bring it out even if the price increased, which was occurring since so much silver was flowing out of China just from buying opium. And combined with what I just said, silver prices were increasing drastically. Obviously, the Chinese government noticed what was going on, and in 1836 started making plans on how to deal with the issue, but first they decided to close down the opium dens and executed those they could find selling the drug. One side of the argument was to actually legalize the process of selling and producing opium. It was just that this time the government would tax it, which would increase the prices, causing people to buy less of it or just simply stop buying it altogether. This would cause some silver to be collected from taxes and slow down the outward flow of silver. The other side of the argument, which was led by Lin Zexu, thought that opium was evil and that they should be punishing those who were selling the drug in China. This side ended up winning, and Lin was basically in charge of the problem at hand. So in 1839, he arrived at the coast where the drug trade was happening to, quote, supervise the ban on opium trade and to crack down on its use, end quote. And from these observations, he thought of ways to end the trade. This included writing a letter to Queen Victoria to ask her about the morality of pushing drugs, arresting 1,600 Chinese dealers and destroying 10,000 opium pipes, and being willing to trade foreign countries' supply of opium for tea. This was obviously targeted at Britain, but when they said no, he ended up stopping all foreign trade in China. This actually ended up stopping the drug smuggling, since 6 weeks later, over 20,000 chests were handed over and ended up being dumped into the ocean. My main source is that before dumping, they would mix the opium with lime and salt. I'm not sure why they did that, I just felt like mentioning it. This seemed to be what actually caused Britain to go to war with China. Arguments that had been around for years started to get more attention, such as that China was out of touch with, quote, civilized nations. This gave the British government an excuse to be Britain and try to expand into China, and they ended up going to war with them in November 1839. Like I said, we're not going to go into the actual war since nothing exciting really happened. I think the most exciting part would be the fact that Britain demolished China since the Chinese weaponry and tactics were ineffective. The Treaty of Nanjing was signed in 1842, which basically had no benefits for China, and Britain made it legal to transport and sell opium in China again. Fun fact, there was actually a second opium war, but that one was much more about Britain wanting to open up more foreign trade ports in China, and the battle was France and Britain teaming up against China. Right, so this next war could get you excited for the next Planet of the Apes movie, since we're going to be talking about the Gombai Chimpanzee War. Before questions are asked about how we know this happened, it happened in the 70s and it was absorbed by the field staff and students in that area. And through my main source, through a window, my 30 years with the chimpanzees of Gombai, the author Jane Goodall has a segment dedicated to talking about the war in detail. This all occurred in Gombai Stream National Park. Starting in 1971, the group of chimpanzees called the Kasakala had their alpha, Mike, stop being the alpha chimp, which surprisingly led to the division within the group. So 6 adult males, 3 adult females, and their children separated into a subgroup and moved south, with 2 of the 6 males, being brothers Hugo and Charlie, leading the group. This group was now dubbed Takahama. These male names are quite important for the war, so let me just say them real quick. Charlie, Goliath, Goldie, D, Willy Wally, who was actually crippled due to polio, and not yet adult but young chimp Sniffy. The original Kasakela group now only contained 8 adult males, 12 adult females, and their children. These chimp names aren't exactly as important, so I'm not going to say them. As the months within the first year of separation passed, there was an obvious increase in violence between the males of the two groups. The groups seemed to have actually grown a disliking towards one another, since by the second year, interactions between the two groups would typically be with them screaming at one another, then retreating back to their territories. The oldest Lakahama males, Goliath, seemed to be chill with the Kasakala's two oldest, Mike and Rudolph, so there was a tiny bit of friendship there. But the war was about to have its first victim, since on January 7, 1974, Goldie would be eating in a tree as a group of 6 Kasakala chimpanzees sneaked up on him. Once Goldie realized that he wasn't alone, he hopped out the tree and tried to run away, but the group was already too close. One of the 6 grabbed Goldie's leg, tossed him to the ground, and pinned him down while the other 5 jumped him. After 10 minutes of beating, Goldie was let go and the others retreated back to their territory, still screaming, as if they were celebrating what they had just done, which was common with all the assaults I'll talk about. Goldie laid motionless for a bit, got up, and gazed at the group as they left. The staff no longer saw him after that, which makes it pretty obvious that Goldie died from his injuries. The second victim was D, who suffered a similar experience to Goldie, only this time he was jumped by a group of 4 rather than 6, and he was beat for 20 minutes rather than 10. D, still wounded and messed up, was actually seen 1 month later by one of the staff members, but then was never seen again. Quite literally, all of these attacks were one Kahama chimp getting jumped by a group of Kasakala, so for now on I'm simply going to mention things that made the attacks different from one another. The third victim was Goliath, who was a top-ranking chimp when Mike was still alpha, and as stated before, was on friendly terms with 2 of the Kasakala after moving south. The staff member who witnessed Goliath's death claimed that the 5 that beat him had a, quote, terrifying rage and hostility, and that it was quite obvious that they were trying to kill him. It was said that one of the chimps constantly twists his leg around as if they're trying to leave like the native rash thing. I don't know what it's called. So this time the chimps didn't celebrate by simple screaming, but seemed to have, quote, drummed on the tree trunks, hurdled rocks, and dragged and through branches, unquote. Similar to Goaty, Goliath sat up and gazed at the group as they went away. There was a search for him the next day, but similar to before, he was not seen again. The fourth victim was Charlie, who didn't actually have his beating be witnessed, but fishermen in the area did say that they heard something. After searching around for 4 days, Charlie's body was found with wounds that made it obvious that he was beaten. The fifth victim was actually a female chimp named Madam B, who was quite old and frail. She had already been attacked before and was still suffering from her wounds, so this time when she was getting jumped, more damage was added to what was already there. It was originally believed that she died right after, but she was actually alive but in a horrible state. She dragged herself into some vegetation and hid so well that they took 2 days to find her, but 2 days after that, she dragged herself around and grew weaker until she eventually died. Willy Wally seemed to have been the sixth victim since he simply just vanished. Nobody knows where he went, but since he was crippled and all the other male chimps have suffered the same fate so far, it was pretty obvious that he was beaten as well. Sniff was the last victim, and at this point, he was now an adult. He actually ended up surviving for another year after the other males passed away, and the staff thought that he was going to be able to make it, but sadly, like everybody else, he was beaten to death. Something I forgot to mention was that this war was 4 years long, and Sniff's death was the end, which means it would have ended in 1978. Sniff's death in a way was seen as the end of the war, because not long after, the remaining chimps in the Kahama tribe were just 2 females and their children, but they disappeared without a trace, and it's expected that they suffered a similar demise as everybody else. Damn, that was kind of sad. Anyways, let's get into some short honorable mentions. This next war is the Andorra-German War, but I like to call it the Gaslit War. For those of you who don't know, what Andorra is this teeny tiny country between France and Spain. So World War I was going on, and as everybody was declaring war against someone, Andorra stepped in as well and declared war against Imperial Germany in 1914. Even though Andorra had declared war, they didn't actually have an army, so they couldn't send anyone over to fight Imperial Germany. So on June 28, 1990, the Treaty of Versailles was signed and World War I was, quote, over. But Andorra didn't sign the treaty, so the war wasn't technically over for them. Fun fact, Germany was no longer Imperial Germany, so Andorra technically won the war, but they kept, quote, fighting on. Since Andorra was basically neutral throughout both world wars, Germany didn't know that they were technically at war with them. It wasn't until 1858 when it was announced in the New York Times that peace was declared between both countries and the war was finally over. So why am I calling this the Gaslit War? Well, most sources I use seem to use a New York Times article as its main source, because the war was quite literally not a war and no battle was fought. It's hard to find any sources to prove that there's an actual declaration of war. There seems to be hardly any evidence that a peace treaty was actually signed, and some people went through the archives and seem to have found nothing. To me, this just seems suspicious, as if the New York Times is pulling one big prank on us and is about to pull out the hidden camera to prove it was all just a lie. But that's just me, and this could have actually happened. It's just a funny thought I had. So similar to before, it's possible that this war actually didn't happen due to a mistranslation. This is the Caligula-Neptune War. It's hard to pinpoint where exactly this war took place, but it seemed to have happened on a French shore. So Roman Emperor Caligula, his men, and war machinery were lined up on the shore with the intention of invading Britain. But instead of getting on the boats and going to Britain, Caligula declared war on the sea and then commanded his men to attack the beach and the sea. Nothing exciting seemed to have happened since it was only stabbing the sand, swinging the weapons, and attacking the water. And as trophies, they picked up seashells and took them back to Rome. It's said that Caligula said to his men to, quote, fill their helmets and tunics with them. So why is it possible that this war didn't happen? Well, one of the main sources was from a biographer, Suetonius, who actually did a biography on the first 12 emperors of Rome, so some biases are entirely possible. Not only that, but it's believed that the men originally didn't want to cross the sea to Britain, so Caligula had them pick up shells as humiliation. Something big is that it's believed that a war actually happened on that shore. It's just that the word people know about comes from a mistranslation. The word conchai was mistranslated into seashell, since it seems to translate to, quote, something in the shape of a shell. Like I said before, it's believed that a war actually broke out on the shore against some British boats, and the Romans picked up the pieces of rubble from the boats and other such things to take as trophies back to Rome. Now let's do some incredibly quick honorable mentions of wars that did actually happen, but I'm not going to cover it since I read a bit about them but found these ones to be more interesting. The Whiskey War was a war fought from 1973 to 2022 between Canada and Denmark over Han Island, which is a small island that's only a half a square mile large. And the fighting seemed to mainly consist of placing flags on the island. And early on, they placed a flag and a bottle of whiskey from the respective country, which gives it the name, the Whiskey War. The Red River Bridge War was a war between Texans and Oklahoma in July 1931, after they built a bridge together but then refused to let people from the other side cross the bridge. And there were interventions of a bridge company that had already built a bridge over that river. The Watermelon War was an uprising in Panama on April 15th, 1856, that was caused when an American took a slice of watermelon from a fruit vendor but refused to pay for it. So that's about it. Like I said, most of these wars I figured out from an iceberg, which will be linked below. Maybe I'll come back and look at more of these wars another time, if I feel like talking about strange wars again. So as always, make sure to like and subscribe if you're enjoying my inconsistency, and that's about it. Okay, bye now.